Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for this presentation about Drunk Mom by Jovita Bydloska. There have been some great presentations shared already, and I hope this one continues the dialogue we've been having about creative nonfiction and allows some further examination of this form of storytelling. Our discussion about Drunk Mom began in Unit 3, and some strong feelings about this book have been shared already. A lot of the reactions are due to the fact that this is nonfiction. It's a difficult story. We read this book knowing that it's a true story, the story of a new mom who suffered from a terrible addiction in her son's first year of life. But is it? How much truth exists in a book whose author admits she spent a lot of the time blackout drunk? And what if it weren't nonfiction? This is a powerful story. Could the same effect be created with fiction? As we continue this presentation, I'd like you to think about those questions. We'll go through and talk about elements of creative nonfiction, and as we do that, I'll offer some thoughts and questions to help us consider the differences between how a topic like this is handled in nonfiction compared to how it might be done in fiction. As we go, I'm also going to share some perspectives from other readers from reviews on Goodreads, which I think highlight how aspects of her approach to this book either work or don't. We're all quite familiar with this work and the author at this point, but let's just take a moment to remind ourselves who she is. Jovita Bydloska was born in Poland, moved to Canada as a teenager, and now lives in Toronto. On her website, she describes herself this way, as the author of the controversial best-selling memoir Drunk Mom and the best-selling novel Guy. She's also a short story writer, journalist, and mentor. In her journalism work, she writes about culture, social issues, and mental health. In an interview with CBC, Bydloska shared that this book started off as fiction. As she described it, she was working on a novel but started thinking about writing something else, maybe, quote, an ordinary villain, a mother who drinks, end quote. What she considered writing was what was actually going on in her life, but she was in so much denial, she said, and she didn't want to make it about her. In the end, of course, she wrote her own true story. When asked why she didn't choose to write it as fiction, or at least publish it under a pseudonym, she explained that she feels she is a case study, and that if she puts a face to addiction and takes the opportunity to talk about it, that makes it more real, and hopefully will be something that will speak to people. You may have noticed, however, that in the note and acknowledgement section of the book, Bydloska included two other reasons for writing it. Second, but most important, she says, this book is an attempt to make amends to my greatest love, my son, Hugo Smith, who I hope will one day be able to forgive me for this transgression. The third reason she lists is the book as a form of apology to her partner and her sister. We'll come back to that later in the presentation. For now, let's look at the way Bydloska writes this story and how it reflects elements of creative nonfiction. Lopate says an author needs to turn herself into a character. It requires distance, he says, and an ability to assess yourself. In some ways, Bydloska does this. She's honest about her behavior and the ways she manipulates situations to hide it. She's clearly moved past her denial. Does she do it too much? Lopate also says it is just as unsatisfactorily distorting to underrate yourself all the time. Bydloska certainly doesn't offer herself much grace in the telling of her story, as shown in this excerpt. In this review, we can see the effect that can have on the reader. Her presentation of herself as a character in some ways pushed this reader away, while also having the desired effect of shedding light on alcoholism. She's also not terribly well-rounded as a character. The book is all about drinking, what she drinks, when she drinks, how she will get the next drink. Her boyfriend is present as a character, but barely, and largely as someone who might catch her drinking. She mentions her job, as in this first quote, but doesn't go into detail about what it is or how she manages to function at work. Perhaps her writing is intended to focus on the motherhood aspect, but even then, she doesn't share much about her day-to-day parenting interactions with her son. There are just a few little details like this second one here. Does that serve her story well? Does it give the reader a sense of how all-consuming this issue was for her? Or is there something lacking in her character development? If this were fiction, the character would probably be more developed, which could offer more insight into the person's challenges and motives, though it might dilute the insight into the daily struggle with alcoholism. Dialogue can be an important part of any story. As Gutkin says, dialogue represents people expressing themselves and communicating information in an easy-to-understand, realistic manner. Bydloska's approach to dialogue reflects her general writing style. It's tight, a bit blunt, mostly short pieces back and forth between characters. There's not much longer dialogue. Here are two examples of dialogue from the book. The first is typical of the way Bydloska uses dialogue to punctuate situations. In this one, we can see the tension in the relationship, even though that's not described in the scene. In the second, there's a more blurry line between dialogue and reflection. Bydloska tucks a very small bit of reflection into this short piece of dialogue. Is it effective? Does it offer any real insight into her character? Or is it just confusing? Bydloska doesn't use quotation marks around dialogue, which sometimes requires the reader to parse dialogue from the author's own thoughts, as in the second example. The grammar nerd in me could go down a whole different track and look at the considerations for using or not using quotation marks, as I think Drunk Mom is a good example that demonstrates the arguments both for and against. I won't do that here, but would be interested in your thoughts on whether the lack of quotation marks is an effective tool or if it creates confusion for the reader. Let's look at the issue of reflection. Gutkin describes reflection as a challenging but essential part of creative nonfiction, especially in personal essay and memoir. Reflection is one thing I would argue is significantly lacking in Drunk Mom. Consider this short example of reflection from Lauren Slater's 3 Spheres. I am not that girl any longer. I tell that to myself as I ride up the hospital's elevator. I found some sort of way into recovery, but I have always known that I could go back. Mysterious neurons collide and break. The brain bruises. Memories you thought were buried rise up. Bydloska's story is essentially a chronological journey through her relapse into alcoholism and her attempts to get sober. There's very little true reflection on what caused her to relapse, what that time was like for her, or what helped her to get sober again. This reader noted that as well, with the effect that the writing, even though it's an extremely personal subject, is seen as impersonal. How critical do you think reflection is to memoir? In his piece called The Whole Truth, Peter Ives says, if nonfiction is burning up the bestseller list, it's not because memoirists have learned to become better liars than fiction writers. Maybe it's because they're just telling a better story. We've discussed the voyeuristic element of this book, and I can definitely see how it might be considered the literary version of watching a train crash. What Bydloska doesn't do is reflect back on that time and share insight on what she learned from it, or how it has informed who she is today. Personally, I think the book would have been stronger if she had done that. I had a look for similar books to see how this topic is treated in different formats. There are a lot of memoirs about alcoholism, some of them with a parenting angle, but there are very few fiction books similar to Drunk Mom, or at least not that I could find. Why do you think that is? Perhaps because this is the sort of topic that requires lived experience to articulate properly. An author could choose to interview people and recreate the experience in fiction, I suppose, but maybe it's stronger as a true story. Or maybe the popularity of memoir and the broader acceptance of issues like substance abuse and the understanding of it as a disease encourages people to share their truth, as it were. With that in mind, let's go back to the second and third reasons Bydloska says she wrote the book. She told her story honestly, brutally honestly, in fact. She shared details she could have left out and includes pieces that shed light on the effect her alcoholism had on her family. But does it suffice as an apology if we can't see what she learned from it? Or is that a private matter, not for the average reader to know? This reader offers a generous perspective on how that apology might be achieved. Bydloska may not offer much reflection, but she doesn't offer excuses either. This is certainly another way to look at it. It could be that the redemption in her story comes not from what she says about it, but from the fact that she did get sober and then chose to share a very personal story in hopes of helping others feel less alone. Let's talk about truth, though. Even if her story is honest, how much of it is true? She wrote the book not long after becoming sober, so this isn't an exercise of looking back at a time in her life years before. Even still, it took place over many months, during which time she was drunk, and often blackout drunk. Is this, as Mimi Schwartz calls it, her emotional truth? This is a case where the reader probably has to allow the author some latitude. Conversations may not be remembered exactly, some of the details might be true, but misremembered. But where exactly she hid the bottles, and whether she gets it right in each instance, is probably not a crucial element. What matters in a story like this is that the details are not deliberately misrepresented or embellished for dramatic effect. Here's a response from a reader who questions the truth of this story as it relates to the baby's safety. Bydloska does share enough that I think one of the first questions the reader will ask themselves is if the baby was safe. So does it matter if she doesn't share every last detail? What role does omission play in the question of truth in creative nonfiction? At this point, I will turn it over to you for some discussion. I've asked some questions throughout the presentation and have offered a few specific ones here and in the forum as well. Thank you for watching my presentation. Look forward to your thoughts, and I will see you in the forum.